My name is Average Joe, and I'm a proud geek with expertise in movies, superheroes, and animation.
My name is Beef Pork Ribs. I'm a fine repository of esoteric knowledge, which I suppose most people would qualify as geeky. Though I dabble in many fandoms, my main areas of expertise are anime, movies, and Belgian comics, with a strong recent insurgency of D&D.
Our mission is to bring nerd and geek culture to the masses
by sticking it all under the microscope.
Welcome to the Bat Jar Podcast.
Movies, comics, graphic novels, TV, cartoons, animation, nerds are geeks, entertainment culture. Hear it on the Bat Jar, Nerdy Power. Nerds and geeks, come gather around the scene. Come and join us in the Bat Jar. Come and tune into Average Joe and his team. Lots of room here in the Bat Jar. When the newest nerdy news drops, these podcast pals put it under the scope. DC, Marvel, Disney, Star Wars, cinematic, multiverse. It's mega Christmas, strangest franchise. Hear it on the Bat Jar, Nerdy Power.
Hello there, and welcome to the Bat Jar Podcast, where we put nerd and geek culture under the microscope.
And we've been doing this for, well, we haven't been doing it for 40 years, but if we had been, how nostalgic would that be?
So people might be wondering what was happening with us. We don't usually. I think this is actually the first time where we just didn't post episodes and didn't provide an explanation. Usually, if we have some sort of break in our content, we're quick to tell you in advance. Oh, by the way, there won't be an episode next week or for a few weeks. But a couple things happened that kind of made it harder for us to record together. The first being, I ended up getting engaged to Tater Tot, and it was on the day we were to record. I mean, we could have made it work, but honestly, priorities took over that week. So, Beeper, thanks for showing your support by not making me show up.
Yeah, that was totally the only reason. Had nothing to do with lack of sleep as well, and a baby. You could have probably just put the blame on Jam Jam for that one.
Well, I wouldn't want to blame a poor little baby. And then
blame your fiance instead?
No, I'm not blaming her. I'm blaming myself. I'm the one who chose when we got engaged.
That is true. You did.
But and then last week, while I was out visiting Tater Tot, I tested positive for COVID-19. So I was isolating last week when we would normally record, and I'm still not. I mean, I tested negative on a rapid test, so I'm recovered, but I still have a lingering cough now. But a week ago, my throat was like I would have sounded really cool on the podcast because my voice was a lot raspier than it normally is. But I was
one of those. Oh yeah, this is just how I naturally sound.
Yeah, but I was pretty exhausted because the fatigue that comes from having COVID-19, it's very real.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think I had it. I ended up not getting tested when I thought I had it because by the time I was able to go, because we didn't have any rapid testing, so by the time I was feeling well enough to go get tested, all it would have done would have been adding like another 5 to 10 days to my isolation, so it didn't feel like it was worth it.
Yeah, I'm lucky because in Nova Scotia, the average person can still just go get a PCR test. And where I live in Ontario, the PCR tests are kind of reserved for just like healthcare workers now. So you have to kind of treat the rapid test like it's an official diagnosis of COVID. But I tested positive on a rapid test, so I was like, let's just go get a rapid or PCR, a full test, and see. But sure enough, that came back positive too. So for anyone who's worried about my health, like I'm feeling pretty fine. I have a lingering cough now and still blowing my nose at least a couple times a day. But I feel back to normal. I just sort of feel like I'm at the tail end of a cold now. So things are good. Apologies to anybody who has been waiting for this episode about 80s nostalgia for the last 2 weeks. We appreciate your patience.
And to be fair, I mean, if you're going to wait for an episode, one that's just talking about nostalgia about 4 decades ago is, not that bad. Especially because it's not like the 80s nostalgia is a particularly new phenomenon either.
That's true. But some significant things have happened in pop culture since we last did an episode. So first of all, Morbius came out. I just saw it yesterday with a friend, and I think a better title for this movie would be More BS.
Oh, that bad, eh?
The movie itself isn't as bad as people are making it out to be. Like, it has like 17% critic score on Rotten Tomatoes. I don't think the movie's that bad, but it's not good either. And it would have worked really well if they had made this version of Morbius a Spider-Man villain. Like, if there was a Spider-Man movie where this Morbius was the bad guy, that would have been really interesting. But to try and build a whole movie around him as the protagonist, and then they repeat the same mistakes so many superhero movies make, where the villain ends up just being another person with the exact same powers.
So it's basically a less campy, worse executed version of Venom.
Yeah, but at least Venom, the movies had that gimmick of, like, you know, the odd couple of them talking to each other. In this, they just don't have that.
Yeah.
So I
So
didn't hate it, but it certainly would have, you know, there certainly was a missed opportunity just to have this character be in a Spider-Man movie. And then after seeing No Way Home and seeing how many of his villains are scientists who were experimenting on themselves or had an accident, you know, Morbius fits right in that because he's a scientist who, you know, had an experiment that went wrong. So I would not necessarily rush out to go watch it. And the post-credit scene, it got a lot of attention for being like earth-shatteringly bad. It doesn't make any sense. I'm not sure what they're trying to do with it. We'll have to wait and see.
I mean, they could be still setting up for some kind of Sinister Six-ish thing, and they were testing the waters to see if maybe he would fit in. I don't think he ever was, but you know, they can reinvent things.
Moon Knight started airing on Disney Plus. I have not seen it yet. Have you checked it out, Beeper?
I have not had the opportunity. I don't know how to feel about it. I mean, I have no personal attachment to Moon Knight as a character. Um, I've heard a few different things about him that don't make me want to not watch it, but also that don't really encourage me. Like, I don't think I'm going to love it from what I've heard, but I think I'll be like, this is a thing that Marvel has done.
And April Fool's Day passed while we were off. Did you fall for any good April Fool's pranks?
Which one?
Well, just any. Like, was there anything that happened on April Fool's Day that got you?
Oh, I see. No, because unfortunately I didn't play League of Legends on April Fools, which I should because they have some interesting things. But yeah, you'd turn into a jungle camp when you'd go back to base. But other than that, I mean, I'm a teacher, so one of my students did spend the entire day trying to stick a fish to my back, and then having failed at the end of the day, just sent me an email with a picture of a fish. So, you know.
I definitely fell for a prank that Watch Mojo pulled. They posted a announcement that following the I'm sure you heard Ezra Miller, who, you know, is in the new Fantastic Beasts movie and he plays the Flash in the movies. He was arrested after something that happened at like a bar in Hawaii where he like threatened some couple, and he has like a restraining order against them now. The prank that I fell for, that Watch Mojo announced that in light of the controversy around Ezra Miller, that Grant Gustin, who plays the Flash on TV, was going to be replacing him in the Flash movie. And I just got excited. I'm like, please let this be true, because I much prefer his version of the Flash to the movie one. And sure enough, when I clicked the link, I got the Rickroll, so it wasn't real.
You got gotted.
I got gotted. And apparently there's rumors even now at Warner Brothers that they're like discussing the future of their relationship with Ezra Miller, like if they're going to do more projects with him. And, you know, at this point, the Flash is already, it would be so expensive for them to actually do that and like reshoot everything with Grant Gustin or even any other actor, especially considering like Ezra Miller's playing like two different versions of Barry Allen in that movie.
I think, like, April Fool's aside, though, it's kind of a weird one because the Flash has had more like, I don't know. I feel like the Flash is very much like Robin. Like, some people have a very big attachment to the character. Some people have a very big attachment to one of them in particular, and then there's a lot of people who don't even know that there's more than one of them, and don't really differentiate. And that's, you know, I feel like there's more of that in DC than Marvel, generally speaking, where it's like, oh, I'm a fan of the Flash. Oh, which one? I'm a fan of Robin. Which one? I'm a fan of Superman. Oh, which one? Well, no, because I mean, there kind of is this idea because there's a lot of Superman movies, or
And there is a second
representation.
Superman in DC Comics right now.
Yeah, there's also Bizarro, which is what I was thinking of when I said that, but different thing.
And we talked about this in our last episode, but I ended up cutting it out of the episode. But just in case people are wondering, Crunchyroll and Funimation have now merged their services. So I have officially stopped paying for Funimation, and now I'm just a Crunchyroll subscriber because all the new content is going only onto Crunchyroll. Funimation's YouTube channel has already been renamed Crunchyroll Dubs. So it definitely seems like that's the way they're going in that merger. It's a matter of Crunchyroll is going to be the brand that survives.
I think I talked about it. Well, I guess it was last week, or we cut it out. But like, I don't. The biggest attachment I had to Funimation was the fact that that's where I got my DVD, like most of my anime collection for DVDs, which is, fairly substantial. I think everything except the DVD case of Gurren Lagann and JoJo's Bizarre Adventure I got from Funimation. No, there's a few other things I got more recently, but like that for a while that was the my one source, and so I have a lot of attachment to that. The streaming service, Funimation now was kind of buggy, and I didn't have it that long. And I did enjoy when Funimation used to have full shows on its YouTube channel. I think they still do somewhat, but that was mostly because one of them that was up there for a long time was Soul Eater, and I absolutely love that show.
Yeah, and it's unclear what's going to happen. It'll probably be like Crunchyroll home video going forward. But anyway, oh, and one more merger. Officially, Discovery has purchased Warner Media from AT&T. So now the Discovery network, which like includes not just the Discovery Channel, but like Food Network and a bunch of stuff, is now part of the same parent company as Warner Media, which is like where DC Comics and Warner Brothers and Cartoon Network reside. And looking at I read an article that kind of showed like it seems like most of the people who are in leadership positions in either organization are maintaining their old roles for the newer company. So how this affects the future of Warner Brothers DC films, there may be more shakeups down the road, or there might be like certain mandates that come, but for now we don't know what they are.
I thought Discovery was one of the things that. Oh no, National Geographic is one of the things that Disney has.
That's right. Yeah. Anyway, all that to say, those are some of the highlights of what's talked about or what has been talked about in pop culture since we last did an episode. So let's dive into today's topic, talking about this idea of 1980s nostalgia. Now, this was thrown in the batch because I think we had like sort of made the observation at some point that a lot of movies and shows are set in the 1980s. So, in doing research on this topic of like 80s nostalgia, or why is 80s nostalgia so prevalent now, people seem to talk about nostalgia as having a 20-year cycle, meaning that generally speaking, something becomes nostalgic when at least 20 years have passed. Would you agree with that diagnosis, that there's generally like a 20-year rule for something to become nostalgic?
Kind of. I don't know. Looking at things, it feels like it's becoming more like 30. And I think that just partially because like we kind of talked about it when we had the turning red thing, and we're like, hey, look, we're starting to have 90s nostalgia. And I don't feel like there's been a whole lot of that, except for maybe like the Spice Girls and the Backstreet Boys coming back, which I guess was about a 20 year ish after their heyday. But no, I think, yeah, but I think it is at least that much, because I think it has to do with, it's when people are starting to be adults thinking back about what was popular when they were kids, kind of thing. And 20 years seems to kind of fit that time frame.
I'm happy you mentioned the kind of like extension of that to like possibly 30 years, because one of the prevailing theories I kept seeing is that generally speaking, people now are waiting longer to start having families. So you have people more focused on careers, and they're spending their 20s, which is the time that, if we were going back to like the 60s, for example, that's when generally people would be getting married and having kids. But in this current era, there's more people kind of advancing their career during their 20s or even into their 30s. And so what happens is that you get people in leadership positions in like business settings, like, or in Hollywood rather, that are older than they used to be because they're hanging in their careers longer. And so there's one of the thoughts about like why 80s nostalgia is so popular is that generally the people who have nostalgia for the 80s have just been working longer than their contemporaries would have in previous generations. And so there's more people who essentially have nostalgia for the 80s. And so they're biased. So they want to see more of the 80s.
Yeah, I I mean, I hadn't thought about it until just now when you mentioned it, but yeah, that definitely makes sense, cuz yeah, people are getting married younger and married older and having longer careers, but I think also, yeah, and staying in careers longer, cuz I'm just looking at the notes, and it was like boomers are the ones with money. Uh but I do think that, it's not just the money, like the money that's in the economy, but also the fact that they have been in positions of authority and in, kind of looking at that for a longer time, yeah, is probably part of why it the 80s lasted longer than some other ones, so than, other decades. Because I do remember, like, the idea of nostalgia being a thing. Like, I remember my dad had this old Doonesbury comics where they were like, it was in the set in it was written, I guess, in the 80s, and being nostalgic for the 60s, and it was like kind of the 20-year thing. And it was the same thing of like, yeah, it was great, but it really wasn't. So I think that's, a little bit what we have with the 80s. But, you always look more fondly on your childhood experiences, probably than you should when you think about them for too long. But people don't like thinking about the past for too long, especially if they remember it positively.
So before we go any farther, I'm just going to define nostalgia, because I feel like that's one of those words that's thrown around a lot, and people might not just know what it means, or they might have an idea of what it means. But nostalgia, in the purest sense, is a sentimental longing or wishful affection for a period in the past. In other words, you have fond memories of a period of time that's passed, and you want to revisit that in some way.
Yeah. And sorry, your description of it really made me think of the Watchmen, where there's all of those, like, it's one of the, almost not a theme per se, but, well, kind of like that. There is a nostalgia in that world where people are looking back at the way things were, but it's in very stark contrast to like the flashbacks we get that show that the past wasn't really great, and that the future is, kind of just a continuation of that.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Like, if you think of like Back to the Future, of course, that's a movie it was made in the 80s, but it was nostalgic about the previous generation. It was showing nostalgia for the 1950s, and I don't know if this was their intention, but when I watch that movie now, it kind of presents the 80s with like, oh, it's kind of like rough and it's like life's kind of hard in the 80s, but then it's like, oh, things were so simple and like nicer in the 50s.
Yeah, but I think that is part of, again, what you said about nostalgia. It's being, listful about things, kind of, regardless of whether it was or not, because I do feel like people do have that about the 80s now, because, and I think it has to do also with the fact that they're focusing on different things, right? Because when they were talking about the 80s, they were talking about how it's harder for kids, and in Back to the Future, it's harder for kids. There was more bullying in schools, or things like that. And in the 50s, they were focusing on the simpler lifestyle, the values. Whereas now, when you have nostalgia for the 80s, they go on like, oh, people had money, they were able to spend, we had better TV. You know, the emphasis on what we're being nostalgic about is also changing.
But it's interesting, like if I go back to that original sentiment of nostalgia going off of a 20-year cycle, because we're now in the 2020s, there should be like this emergence of content nostalgic for the 1990s. And for the most part, I don't think there is a whole lot of it. I think there's like Saved by the Bell has had like but that's more of a sequel set in modern day. Like I don't see the 90s nostalgia, but I still see lots of nostalgia for the 80s.
I mean, I think, we did kind of touch on why a little bit, but I think also, uh, like, the 90s nostalgia is, I think there's this weird thing because there is some of it coming through, but it's in kind of more niche settings. Um, but I think, like, I can think like, I don't know if you've seen the Mitchells versus the Machines, but that is kind of like 90s, even early 2000s nostalgia almost in some of the things, because that's kind of where it was set. And Turning Red is also doing that, so it's starting to happen. But we haven't quite. I think the early 2000s is a thing we haven't really hit much, which I'm quite happy because I didn't. I don't know. I was alive at that time. I remember it, and I'm not looking at it in a very wistful kind of way. But maybe that's just the cynic inside of me, But like, and maybe it is because there's. I feel like there's less of a separation in the time period too, because like I don't know if this makes sense, but like, the 80s was the Cold War, was some, there were a lot of very major changes in society and in the world that happened. Whereas like the 90s and the 2000s kind of start to bleed together a lot more than the 80s. And, maybe that's just me thinking about it because it's all things that I've lived. So it's my life and I kind of don't separate them as much. But I do feel like there is something very distinctly different about the 80s that is very different from today. Whereas I think a lot of the events we still see the link between things that happened in the 90s and what's happening today in the world.
I mean, people would point to 9/11 as something significant that changed the whole world in the early 2000s, but
Yeah, but it didn't really denote a completely different era either, if that makes sense. Like, and if you do think, like, if you do talk about it, we're still kind of in that turmoil that was kind of created by it.
yeah, I'm not a political scientist, so I won't comment on that. But I know one thing that it's not just specific to the 80s, but one thing even about the early 2000s that I appreciate is that technology was less advanced than it is now. And I had to imagine from the perspective of a writer, it's probably very attractive to write a story set in not modern day because the convenience of cell phones and the internet, like it makes it so much harder to tell a compelling story. I know I'm trying to paint writers as like they're lazy, but if you think about like the Home Sweet Home Alone thing, they really had to go out of their way to write around the fact that he was stuck home alone because of how modern technology is. It just wouldn't make sense for him to be stuck home alone. But if you have something set in like the 80s where there weren't cell phones or the internet, whether you're writing a horror movie or a kids movie or a romantic comedy, you know, it's a lot easier to write a story with fewer contrivances. Like you can't have a misunderstanding between two characters or something bad happen and have that kind of linger because there isn't the ability for like instant communication to resolve the problem.
Yeah, I think like I do understand that perspective of it, and it definitely is something that I think does affect things. But like I don't know, I feel like the amount of misunderstandings that we've lived and that have happened because of too much communication can be just as valid. And like I don't know, I feel like people also, and this is something I like when I was thinking about this, I do think that there is a little bit of the 80s nostalgia has been kind of bleeding into the 90s because there are some things that they have, like they're like, oh yeah, it was the beginning of the internet and dial-up things, and I'm like, yeah, but dial-up internet was still very much a thing for most of the 90s. Like even just like they talk about older computers, but like do you remember the things that used to run on Windows 95? Like before Windows 98, we still had old computers. They still could not do like anything that modern computers can do, but people tend to be so like focused in on kind of like the marketability of the 80s, possibly because people who are nostalgic for the 80s have more money than people who are nostalgic for the 90s. But you are getting some things that did have to do with the 90s that are kind of still making their way into it, if that makes sense. And like and it's an interesting thing too, because like I think there's this weird thing about like music in the 80s that people are being so nostalgic for, but again, like a lot of those bands kept going into the 90s, and some of them even just got better then, but we don't talk about kind of like typical 90s music as much.
Yeah, like when I think of 80s music, it's very clear what 80s music is, and it feels like there's just all these bands that hit either they hit the peak of their power in the 80s or there were so many one-hit wonders in the 80s. And some people think like the music video, that was a product of the 1980s. Like basically the way you marketed songs completely changed in the 1980s. And so I wonder if there's like a lot of songs that have like entered pop culture, attention simply because of the fact that they would have had a music video.
Yeah, but again, I think the same thing is a little bit like what I just said kind of happens in a way, because 90s, I feel like like the yes, music videos started in the 80s, but the 90s is where it became kind of like a much more part of pop culture. I don't know, like the MTV generation kind of idea does still happen very much on like in the 90s as well. It's still a big part. It was still a big part of it. It's just that also in the 90s you had that weird change, which I think is the biggest problem with people not having a distinct idea of it, is that the 90s is when we started transitioning from bands into artists, but there were still bands and it isn't just artists, because I feel like the solo artist really hits its strides in the 2000s, but the 90s is this weird transition period that was kind of both.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a music expert, but I feel like it's harder for me to identify what was music in the 90s other than like boy bands and Britney Spears.
I mean, yeah, kind of, but AC/DC was still popular in the 90s. They did most of their hits in the 80s, but people don't often associate AC/DC with the 80s either, right? And you do have, all of grunge kind of like making its way, and people don't really talk about it as much. But that was, pretty big and influential. So I don't know. It's not like it isn't defined. I think it's also just like, and also like a lot of electronic music did definitely start becoming bigger and bigger because like, even the annoying part of it, like Crazy Frog, we both that's a very
Ba-ding,
90s
ba-ding.
thing. Yeah, but like, or you know, uh Eiffel 65, when did I'm Blue come out? Like somewhere in the 90s, right?
Maybe. But the 80s was also like the era of the teen movie. Like this John Hughes kind of came in and started making all these movies about the teenager experience that had never really been, I guess, captured on film before. So maybe
Except in the 50s.
okay, fair, but like I guess when I'm referring to like the more modern teen movie, that there's like this group of people who were coming of age in the 80s, and I don't know, maybe they found these movies that identified with them, and so then their nostalgia for the 80s is tied to those movies that kind of like spoke to their experience, and so they're holding on to that even now.
Yeah, and which is, yeah, actually interesting because I just thought about it, but like, part of what we were talking about, how like people are getting married later and people are kind of like changing. There is kind of this weird thing where like it almost feels weird to have a coming of age story happen at the end of high school for our generation, if that makes sense. Like, I feel like the coming of age is happening after high school, much more in college, university than it used to, because I don't know how your experience was with university. We're both 90s kids. We can say these kind of things, but like, I distinctly, like, I know a lot of people had this experience that I know that, like, their first year or two in university was basically just an extension of high school, or it didn't feel like it was that different until a little bit later. And maybe that's kind of part of what it is too, is that the coming of age has also changed when it happens. And that means that people are not quite as attached to them as they used to be.
It's true. I mean, I did an extra year of high school, so that certainly helped me feel more emotionally prepared to go away to school. But certainly, yeah, like my coming of age definitely happened more in the university years than high school. I guess I'm also thinking like the 1980s. I wasn't alive then, but from what I can gather, but it's like, yeah, there was the music and there was the teen movies, but also you had all these franchises based on toys that were really popular with kids. And I know like that whole Netflix series, The Toys That Made Us, has tried to suggest that the toy franchises of, the 80s did a lot to inspire people to pursue careers, so like GI
Mm.
Joe, Transformers, My Little Pony, Cabbage Patch Kids, Ninja Turtles. Like you had all these He-Man, you had all these franchises based on toys that, again, I guess for kids, people who are like kids in the 80s, they have these like these fondnesses for these franchises that perhaps is like why we continue to see those different franchises come back.
Yeah, but I mean, but that also, you know, uh, I remember, I don't remember if it was a documentary or a video, but talking about how that is something that, the level of advertisement done in those toy franchises that also became media franchises is something that you can't actually do these days. Like, people are a lot more discerning about what they allow as advertising. Um, and series that are just a pure advertisement for something are kind of being uh, petered out. But it is something that the 80s did create, and it did create a lot of intellectual properties that have kept going far beyond what they probably should have, just because they were so iconic. Like, the only thing that vaguely resembles that still exists is basically, Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh, both of which actually were from the 90s and, you know, also came from Japan, which is why it kind of, you know, muddles the water a little bit too.
Yeah. But then even beyond franchises that actually had their launch in the 80s, there's been a couple different things that have happened that have kind of furthered this narrative of that 80s nostalgia, or like things in the 80s were better. Like, first of all, you have Ready Player One, which as a book, which was written in like the 2010s, really hits home this idea that 80s nostalgia is best. And I know the movie kind of expanded the lore of the Oasis to include franchises that, existed beyond the 1980s. But from what I remember, the book, it kind of like imagines the Oasis as just 80s nostalgia, which I kind of raised this issue when we watched and reviewed that movie, that it kind of makes it very sad that like pop culture never quite got past the 80s in the world of the book. But maybe that's what he was trying to suggest, that the 80s is the best.
Maybe that's the reality we're living in right now. Yeah, but again, I do like. I think we did kind of hit on some of the things. Is that the people who were 80s kids have been in the workforce longer and in higher levels, so that they can control what the media is a little bit more. But I think, again, you talk about like kind of what is being, you know, uh, how nostalgia is being perceived, right? And I think that is definitely something that is changing more and more, is that people are trying to be less nostalgic and more realistic in the way that we look back on things. And that might just be it might be a generational thing, that past the 80s, like, people are starting to look at what they grew up with in a more critical way. And you know with the it might be one of the ramifications that we never thought about of critical theory being a philosophical current that has gained a lot more ground with people of our generation and beyond, is that it diminishes the need or the appeal of nostalgia, for you know actually looking at the way things are and the way things were and how they've affected how things are happening. And ultimately, I think, again, it comes when we talked about like Back to the Future was a bit nostalgic for the 50s. Well, the 50s and the 80s shared in this kind of very optimistic vision of how the world could be. The 60s also kind of had that. The 70s not as much, but I think the 1990s definitely did not have that idea. I think a lot, like, even just the idea that like how popular emo was in the late 90s, early 2000s, it was a very much a bleaker outlook on the world and not something as
Y2K,
hopeful.
man.
Well, yeah, okay, you say that as a joke, but like that was the mentality at the end of the 90s, was that, yeah, there's this giant virus that's going to wipe everything out. That's not a very cheerful thing to think about, or optimistic. I think it more so than cheerful. There isn't the same inherent, I think, optimism in our generation that might have been there in the 80s. And like and I think it might come around again in about 20 years, because I do think that, in small or large part, because of like the influence of anime and the very large escapism that is attached to it, most of it being based on power fantasies, even though that's not what anime these days is 100%, it's still based around a lot of ideas that were developed in that. It You might have this kind of new wave of people who have like the power of friendship, or the power of God and anime on their side, and do start to be a little more optimistic about the future. But I don't think that's our situation.
I hadn't really thought about that. I'd have to sit with that idea. Is this generation less optimistic about the future? I guess when you think of like Greta Thunberg and people who are of this generation kind of like speaking out against the way things have gone, that certainly would support that theory.
Yeah, and I think just a lot of it kind of works that way.
Another piece of media that people on YouTube anyway seem to really think has helped foster this interest in 80s nostalgia is the video game GTA Grand Theft Auto Vice City. I've never played any Grand Theft Auto game, but apparently this is a video game that like was set in the 1980s, and apparently it did a lot to inspire interest in the 1980s for, I guess, a generation of people playing video games that didn't live in the 80s. Have you ever played this one?
I have not played it, but I am aware of its influence and kind of how big it was. I didn't realize it was set in the 80s, but it does make sense, and I think I don't know, I hadn't thought of it, and even now that you mention it, I'm not sure because I didn't actually actively play it, but it does. I think there are a few. Yeah, there are a few things that were set in the 80s that, or even things that were made in the 80s that are starting to like gain a bit more popularity, partially because they're a little strange. I don't know. I'm just thinking about um, Mother or the Earthbound games, and the influence they've kind of had on pop culture and how it's kind of like starting to seep into different things that are happening. It's, I think again, like you were talking about some of the like the writing contrivances or ease to make simple story, but I do think it also kind of speaks to like, again, we're nostalgic about the time we could let our kids go out and do whatever they wanted. We didn't have to lock them inside. Even though another big staple of 80s movies is just how violent the bullies used to be and how nobody used to be able to control them. So like, there's definitely the nostalgic angle there, but it is like it does have that, again, that positive connotation, that very not just positive, but which is what nostalgia is, but also that optimistic connotation to it, that now it's a lot more about, well, we had to keep kids inside, and that's, with the whole global pandemic happening, that feeling is not going away.
Yeah, and beyond the reality of people starting families later and whatever, having the people having intentional nostalgia for the 80s being in leadership positions, we also just practically, as time has gone on, there's more content available. There's more decades of content to be nostalgic for, and the internet and streaming services have made it very easy for people to discover content from generations past. Like, even though I didn't live in the 1980s, I feel like I've consumed a lot of media that would have been originally created in the 1980s, and if I had lived in a previous generation, I wouldn't have as much access to 80s content. I'd have nostalgia for the stuff I would have seen, but then I wouldn't have the backlog of more content going farther back. So it is interesting. Like, we're now into the 2020s. So technically the 2000s should be like the decade that we're getting nostalgic for, but yet there's still an abundance of nostalgia for the 80s, and we're seeing some for the 90s. So maybe there's just something about the 1980s that, in the midst of all the decades that have come before, it still stands out as like the prime setting for new content. Because it's not just nostalgic 80s franchise that are coming back. We have things like Stranger Things and the movie 8-Bit Christmas that is like set in the 1980s, that are like new things that are coming up, but they still are capturing that 80s nostalgia.
Yeah, and I hadn't thought about that, but it's true that like it used to be a lot more, to watch something from a previous generation. It was a lot more, it had a lot more to do with like, oh, this is what your parents watch, but like this isn't even what our parents watched anymore. But at the same time, it is also a lot easier for parents to show what they used to have. And you know the advent of home video did kind of start in the 80s, 90s, and the idea of being able to own a movie, I think, definitely also started to be a lot stronger in in that generation, and so being able to hold on to nostalgia and hold on to earlier intellectual properties and give them to people, you know, share them with future generations has become a lot easier.
So I think we've solved this mystery. There's tons of reasons why so many modern TV shows and movies choose to set themselves in the 1980s, and there's tons of reasons why franchises from the 80s have stuck around. So I don't know, Beeper, I'm happy to kind of put the stamp of mystery solved on this one.
Yeah, case closed, as they say in anime.
Or Detective Conan, depending how you talk to.
Yeah, I'm glad you caught that.
So
Which is also something from. Wait, no, I think Case Closed might have started in the 70s. It might be that old. I'm not sure.
If you want to reach the show, you can send us an email at
batjarpodcast@gmail.com.
or you can tweet us at
The Bat Cookie Jar.
You can find the Bat Jar Podcast wherever you listen to podcasts, including YouTube, because we got a channel. Share our posts on Facebook, write reviews, give our shows a rating. This will help all people join us inside the Bat Jar, and we appreciate it dearly.
So this is normally when we would go inside the Bat Jar to pull a topic for next week. I can just pull some out of the jar, but I do want to acknowledge, like, the first movie that we reviewed on the podcast together after you became co-host, and the first appearance of Mjolnir on the Bat Jar was when we reviewed the Sonic the Hedgehog movie. And there is now a sequel to that movie out in theaters. So I think if not next week, at some point we should definitely talk about it, because it's nostalgic for us basically to talk about Sonic the Hedgehog.
Was the first Sonic game in the 80s, or was it already the 2000s?
I think
the 90s.
I think it was a 90s thing.
I think so too, right? It's got to be. I hope so. Also, I did recently just look it up, and actually, Case Closed did start in the 90s. Although now that I look at it, oh, never mind. It's the remake, so maybe not. It must have been earlier. Yeah, when is Moon Knight ending?
It's
We're probably
6
going to have to do
episodes,
that too, right?
so I think this is only episode 3 this week.
Okay, so we got a little bit of time to kind of get started on that. I am not entirely sure that I can get to the movie this week, but if we give it 2 weeks, I'm sure I can. So how about we grab something from the Bat Jar for next week, and then by the week after, I'll have figured out a way to see it.
Yeah, I mean, it is Easter this coming week, so for some people it is a lot harder to get to the movies during that time.
Yeah, that's true.
Although apparently my mom wants to go see the new Fantastic Beasts movie, so I might end up seeing that before Sonic. Oh boy, well, you're going to be happy with this, Beeper. We've got Conker's Bad Fur Day.
Oh, am I the reason that's in there?
Yes, you definitely are.
Okay. Well, look, it's a great video game, and we'll talk about it. And that's some 90s nostalgia right there.
Yeah. All right, so come back to the Bat Jar Podcast next week when we talk about Conker's Bad Fur Day. And until that time, I'm Average Joe.
I'm Beef Pork Ribs.
Catch you on the flip side.
And context sensitive.